Great. Thank you very much for joining us here, and an apology that I'm not speaking in Japanese, but I don't think you'd understand a word of what I was saying, so I'm sorry about that. We're going to try and make this do a sort of English-style Japanese event. In other words, feel free to talk, ask questions, contribute during the event. We've got a few speakers and then plenty of opportunity for discussion. We're really excited to be here, partly because you will be aware of this, but about 6 weeks or so ago I saw a news article that mentioned your Prime Minister that talked about a very real concern in Japan that the ageing of society was threatening potentially the sustainability of Japanese life, and very, very powerful words he used. And clearly for ILC as an organisation, we're interested not necessarily just in older people, but actually how our ageing of our society, whether that be Japan or the UK or Korea, it impacts upon all people. So how does it impact on younger people as well as older people? We are, as I was saying, very grateful for you for joining us today. We're really delighted to have you along here in Niigata alongside the G7 event happening over the next couple of days. For those of you who don't know the International Longevity Centre in the UK, we are one of 16, so we have an ILC in Japan, and I know some of you know the International Longevity Centre in Japan, and we'll be seeing them tomorrow. But we work across the world on issues around ageing society. And of course we have very, very similar and sometimes very different challenges. You know, what's driving, the challenges around working longer in the UK is different to in other countries, for example. We've got some really interesting challenges in places like, have we got anyone from America here? Be careful. No, so we've got some very interesting challenges in America where actually life expectancy is being very significantly impacted by the fact that younger people are dying from gunshot wounds, from road traffic accidents, from opioid addiction. So you've got a very different sort of issue around life expectancy in places like the US than you have in, and of course you have very different healthcare systems as well than you have in places like Japan. And it's what makes it fascinating, of course. I'd like to thank some of our funders and the people we work with. So that's Amgen, GSK, Hallmark, MSD, Pfizer, and Sanofi. And I know some of those are in the room with us. Perhaps also to mention we've done quite a few events in and around Japan last year, and I know some of you joined us. We had an event in the British Embassy in Tokyo, and I caught COVID, so I couldn't join you, but some of you saw me on my green screen behind. So I was very, very sad to miss that. But we also ran an event alongside the G20 in Okayama in 2019. Clearly this event comes at a very, very important time for us as an organisation. In a couple of weeks' time at the World Health Assembly, we're going to be launching a brand new global index that looks at healthy ageing and prevention. And my colleague Aaron's going to tell you a bit about what we found. What we want to do with this index is use it to begin to have conversations about how we can all improve as our society ages. You might say, well, why finance ministers, not health ministers? And the main reason for that is because, we came along to the health ministers in 2019 and essentially they all agreed. They all agreed prevention was really important. They all agreed investing in ill health was really important. Actually, what they said is you need to talk to my friends, the finance ministers who hold the money. So we wanted to sort of actually get a message that longevity is about, not just about health, but actually about economic prosperity. And we have some very strong economists in the room. And for example, ILC's work, our own analysis shows that across the G20, people who are healthier, they spend more money, they work longer, they volunteer more, and they care more. There is a direct productivity and economic relationship between health and finance. And I think it's really important that finance ministers begin to understand this a little bit better. However, despite this sort of consensus, clearly after, with the WHO last week announcing that COVID was no longer an emergency, actually we're in a place where governments are very quick to think about, well, we believe in prevention, but we have all of these emergencies here we need to fix first. And then I think part of the conversation is how can we address that? How can we address that challenge that is very, and not move back to the new normal and reflect on and learn the lessons of COVID. One thing that's interesting from the event that you'll see, from the index that you'll see, is both the UK and Japan do very well. I have to say, as a British person, we like to put ourselves down. I was very surprised how well the UK does on this index, relatively. But it's the idea of the index, as I say, is for us to start to use it to have conversations about what works and how society is different in different places. What else was I going to say? Clearly, alongside our Global Health and Ageing Index, which we'll talk about as an introduction, we're going to talk a little bit about some issues around, a classic intervention around prevention, which is life course immunisation, and how we can make sure that we're thinking about immunisation as a preventative tool, and what impact that might have on how we score individual countries. So I'm going to stop there to say just a huge thank you for joining us here today. I'm going to ask my colleague Aaron to come up and say some words. And then as I say, we have a few speakers. We have, and I'll introduce them as they come up, and then we have a conversation. So, Aaron, thank you very much again for joining us. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Really delighted to be here today and to present to you on our Healthy Aging and Prevention Index. So I'm Erin Himawan. I'm the Senior Health Research Lead at ILC, and I've, over the last year, been working to develop this with colleagues, and I'm really excited to share the findings with you. So before I sort of go straight into the findings, maybe a little bit of context as to what brought us to develop an index. Because there are indexes that already exist out there. So what's so special about ours, especially? So over the last 4 years, we've been engaging in a global preventative health program of work, and this really comes from what David was talking about. There's a very clear need for us to invest in preventative health, particularly in an aging society, and we know that it's not just health benefits that we see, but there's also economic benefits. So just across the G20, we see that it's over $1 trillion it's lost due to productivity loss among those just aged 50 to 64. And on the right-hand side, you can see sort of a breakdown of what that looks like for each of the sort of largely preventable conditions. So we're not talking about small amounts of money. We're actually talking about significant impact on the economy. But what we also know is that it's not just about spending more on prevention. Even just small increases can actually unlock, significant economic benefits. 9% of spending every year by people aged 60 or over. So just even small increases by government can lead to economic benefits to their society. But one of the things that we continue to see is that many countries aren't spending enough on prevention. And across the OECD, average spend is only 2.8% of health budgets, spending that's on prevention. So we really want to see government spending at least 6% of their health budgets on preventative health. So we still have some ways to go. And that's where the Healthy Aging and Prevention Index comes in. It's really about demonstrating to governments what they can be doing to improve their society, improve their population. And to incentivize them a little bit. No one likes to see their country not do well on an index, but there are solutions. That's the good thing. It's not just about naming and blaming countries at all. It's actually about giving them the tools to actually understand what it is that they can do to improve. So that's sort of where we've come to with the index. And so I want to speak a little bit about what it is. So the index it's global, and it essentially holds government to account on healthy aging and prevention. It measures and ranks 121 countries on 6 metrics. So that includes lifespan, health span, work span, income, environmental performance, and happiness. So for the first time, this index actually brings together health, wealth, and societal metrics. A lot of indices that already exist focus on one or the other. So what we're trying to do is bring these various different aspects, these different contributions from global data together so that people can very easily see what's going on in their country. So these metrics are really sort of the demonstrate how sustainable countries are in the context of longer lives and the extent to which governments are investing in efforts to prevent ill health. Aside from ranking countries, we also rank political and economic country blocks, such as the G7, EU, and OECD, and I'll speak about that in my later slides. So a little bit about those 6 indicators. So life and health span, these are measured at birth using life expectancy and healthy life expectancy. And you can see the top 5 countries for lifespan just at the bottom here. So Japan, Switzerland, South Korea, Spain, and Singapore. For health span, we have Japan again, number 1, Switzerland, South Korea, South Korea, Switzerland, and Israel. So not too much difference between lifespan and health span, so a lot of commonalities, but there's a few in there that are featured for the first time. We also have work span, so this is defined as the expected number of years spent between being economically active and in retirement, so that's between the ages of 15 to 65. And we express this in years. And here you can see the top 5 countries are Cambodia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Burundi, and Laos. This is a very interesting metric, and I'm happy to speak about this in more depth. But despite actually seeing quite a few African countries in this list, these are outliers, and the African Union doesn't, as a whole, doesn't do very well on work span. So we also have income, and here again you can see the top 5 countries there. And then we also have environmental performance, and this is taken from the Yale Environmental Performance Index. So what we see is the average EPI rating is 48.8, and then you can also see the top 5 countries: Denmark, Luxembourg, Switzerland, UK, and France. And then finally we have happiness. So this positions countries on a scale of 0 to 10. 0 to 4 is interpreted suffering, and then struggling, and then we have finally thriving. We take this data from the annual Gallup World Poll, and which asks respondents to think of a ladder, and they're asked to rate their own current lives on that scale. So the top 5 countries here we see are Finland, followed by Switzerland, Denmark, Iceland, and Norway. This is the top 50 countries on our global index. So you can see the UK does ever so slightly better than Japan. But when we go into actually looking at the metrics, Japan does better than the UK on a few of them. So maybe you see something that's a bit surprising here, maybe you don't. Maybe you expected to see some countries in the top 50 and you don't. It's maybe the other way around. But any country that's ranked the same number, that's because they've, through our methods, have the same numerical value that we generate, so they're also given the same ranked position in the index. These are the top 5 countries on the index, and so you can get a sense of how well they do and for all these different metrics. So we do see high lifespan, high health span as well. We're still seeing differences between life and health span, so this is obviously an area for improvement for many countries, even those at the top where we're seeing ill health is affecting people in their older ages. And this is just an image of what the prevention index will look like when we launch it in the next couple of weeks. So it's an online tool in a map, and you can scroll across any of the countries and learn about their index position and about the different metrics. And then you can also, on the right-hand corner at the top, go through each of the individual metrics to get a sense of how well countries are doing. The lighter the country, the better they perform on the index. So what we find is there's actually quite a lot of inequality. So only the top 1% of the world population is best adapted to longer and healthier lives. So we can see the 1 to 10 at the beginning of the graph, that is the countries that are positioned 1 to 10 on the index. That only represents 1.1% of the population. The top 50 countries only represent just over a quarter of the population. So very few people are actually benefiting from longer, healthier lives. So there's a lot of improvement that can be made here. We also see significant inequalities between countries at the top and the bottom of the index. So if we look at each of these three metrics, life expectancy, lifespan, health span, and work span, we see there's a 24-year gap, a 21-year gap, and then a 23-year gap. So huge amounts. As I mentioned, the index also ranks political and economic blocks. So what we can see here is the ranking. So Scandinavia ranks at the top, followed by the G7, so not too bad. But I'm sure all of your eyes have gone straight to the EU, 28.6 for work span. And this is indicative of the labor shortages and skills shortages that we're seeing in the region. But it only, it does particularly where's the worst of all of these political groups, even the African Union, who does slightly better, but only slightly better. But still, it's something that clearly political leaders will have to address in the coming months and years. So if we look at the G7, we see that Canada ranks at the top, the UK second place, and then Japan fourth. But as you can see here, and what I was mentioning before, when it comes to lifespan and health span, Japan does significantly better than the UK. In fact, Japan ranks, as I mentioned, first for health span, and the UK ranks 28th for health span. So huge differences. But it's work span, income, environmental performance, and happiness, where the UK does slightly better and therefore ranks slightly above Japan in this case. So I wanted to sort of end this presentation just to tell you a little bit about what we plan to do with the prevention program with this index. So as I mentioned, we want to hold governments to account by tracking progress on prevention through the production and launch of this digital healthy aging and prevention index. And I should say, in the next years, we also want to get new data so that we can compare countries across time and see if they've improved in their position or if their ranking has gotten worse. One of the other things that we will be looking at is comparing the index against various different secondary metrics. So what we've already found, and we'll be talking about this at the launch of the World Health Assembly, but what we've already found is that countries that invest more in preventative health do better on the index. We also find that countries that invest more on immunization, so not just prevention, but specifically on immunization programs, do better on the index. We also find that there's the top 50 countries, the top half countries on the index have 4 times better access to doctors than the bottom half of the index. And to give you sort of the range of that, we're talking about those that perform sort of in the first 10 countries have about 40 doctors per 10,000 population. At the bottom of the index, we see that this goes down to only 5 doctors per 10,000 population. So huge inequalities again there. And what we want to do with this index is really just engage global leaders and move really from commitment to action on preventative health. So like I said, increasing prevention spend to at least 6% of their health budgets. Alongside the index, we're also building strong relationships with organizations, and we have about 23 organizations and individuals that have come together under the Healthy Aging Prevention Coalition. And we're going to use this coalition to demand action and hold governments to account, because I think one of the things we've realized is no matter where people sort of come in terms of their expertise in public health, prevention is something that we can all get behind and agree that is really important. So hopefully with our united forces, we can actually get the ear of governments and see action over the next few years. So thank you all very much.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. And I'm going to now introduce, and apologies for my pronunciation, Dr. Haruki Matsumoto, and to add a few words. Thank you, Harry.
So thank you very much, David, Aaron, for inviting me to this wonderful opportunity to share Japan and Niigata experience and situation. Let me introduce myself. I'm currently Director General, Health and Welfare Department, Niigata Prefectural Government. Actually, exchange officer from the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, Japan National Government. So my boss is not the finance minister, just health minister. So he always say that the prevention is okay, great, green, like that. But in Japan, we are facing the challenge, like the rapidly aging and economical challenge as well. I'm MD. I have 3-year clinical experience, but mostly my professional career is about the Health Ministry of Japan. I earned Master of Public Health from Harvard. My concentration is health policy. So let me introduce the actual fact about the aging and prevention in G7 country and Japan. As Aaron said, the world is getting older, so the very important agenda is healthier and longer life. And I would like to introduce Japan's secret, very open secret. Lifestyle matter. Healthier lifestyle is very important to living a longer and healthier life. So the fish, vegetable, etc. Are important. And as Aaron mentioned, the work span, I think the more active life is very important, and the factor is keep working or not, and also reducing, etc. So I would like to introduce the health span and healthy span. As Aaron said, in Japan, we appreciate the longest lifespan and health span. And let's look into the lifestyle. So very important thing is diet, lifestyle. So the number one, a vegetable intake. Let's see the first one. Japanese have a lot of vegetable, but less than United States. So guys, why this occur? Why American have more vegetable than Japanese? Any idea?
Potatoes, chips.
Yes.
Chips, fries.
And,
Yeah.
Potatoes. Just the answer. Japanese think that the potato is not healthy food, like chips, French fries, like that. But in the global analysis, the potato is ranked the vegetable. So, we eat more like carrot, like other green veggies, and also the fish. Japanese have a lot of fish in UK as well. Is it true?
Fish and chips. So we only eat fish when it's really unhealthy. So when it's got lots of fat and batter on top of it. Yeah. We don't like fresh fish. Just.
Okay.
Yeah. We work hard to keep ourselves as unhealthy as
And of course, the less fat than the global level. And this is the Japanese traditional cuisine. It's not just traditional, the contemporary style, like my breakfast, like this. And I heard that UNESCO registered this kind of washoku, Japanese traditional cuisine, to cultural heritage of the world. And as David said, addiction. Drug addiction is very important issue in the world. This recently, I'm very sad to introduce the data that the lifetime experience rate of methamphetamine is more than 10% in UK, 5% in United States, but less than 1% in Japan. And as David said, there in United States last year, more than 100,000 people died from their opioid addiction. And the secondary, the alcohol intake, I was surprised because I thought Japanese have more sake, but actually in UK there a lot of alcohol consumption and obesity rate difference. In Japan, the very small rate of the obesity. I think it's due to the healthier lifestyle, and secret is here. In Japan, today's topic is aging. So not only the work span, but also the labor force participation in 65 and older, like elder adults. In Japan, the pension system is not so great as UK or United States. So people might be people have to work in elderly in Japan. More than quarter people keep working in Japan for elderly. And maybe due to that, the average number of daily step is huge in Japan. The Japanese is automobile society, but if you have to work, you should take train, taxi, like that, so that you should walk every day. So I think the keep working is the key factor of the healthy aging. And this is the within Japan analysis, prefectural unit. There is strong correlation between the healthy lifespan and labor force participation. This is the secret number 2 in Japan. There are strong correlation as well, seafood intake and healthy lifespan. The fish and work matters. And let me introduce the Niigata prefecture here. We have more than 2 million people, this prefecture. We are proud of the lowest BMI, obesity rate in Niigata, and relatively high healthy lifespan. I think this is surprising data, and our prefecture is the lowest health expenditure, I think, due to the healthy lifestyle. And just because like the higher intake of seafood, higher intake of vegetables, like that. So today, this week, Niigata, their G7 gathering, high-level gathering for the finance minister, and the question is, living longer and healthier is good. However, how much does it cost? So let's see the health expenditure per capita. Japan is not so high. It seems okay. But if you look at the health expenditure percent share of GDP, Japan now has the 5th highest country now. However, let's see the correlation, or if you account for the aging rate, elderly rate, Japan is, I think the Japanese health expenditure is not so high. This line is the prediction line by the regression. Japan is just on the line. Other G7 countries is above the prediction line if you account for the aging. So I think this is because due to the healthy lifestyle or the low substance abuse or the very fair, equal society in Japan. So the summary, Japan has a healthy and total lifespan, high intake of vegetable, fish, washoku, Japanese cuisine, and a lot of steps daily. Job rate, keep working rate is very high. Low fat, low obesity, low drug abuse, and moderate health expenditure. In our prefecture, Niigata, there is high life expectancy and vegetable and fish, very healthy lifestyle, and low obesity rate and health expenditure. So my thought and my key message is that prevention is very important, but there is no royal road to healthy life, nothing. It's better than prevention, and prevention need huge effort. This graph shows that the Japanese long-standing effort to decrease the salt intake. We pay effort in 70 years for just 6 gram reduction of salt intake. So I think there is no royal road to healthy life. We need pay effort every year to get the healthier aging. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Brilliant, thank you. It's really, really useful, and of course quite sad that the UK is so good at alcohol as well as bad food. But actually, clearly, the purpose of us having our index was to start to expose some of these conversations about what works and what doesn't. And I'm sure you're aware, but the whole of the world really looks to Japan and say, how does Japan do it? You know, how do you keep people so healthy? And one thing I would add, which might be useful for a conversation afterwards, after having coming from Tokyo, is clearly one of the other interesting things is issues is around active travel, and of course in the UK everyone drives half a mile, and in places like Tokyo's it's very, very difficult to even own a car. So, and I think that makes a very big difference into the extent to which people do the steps you were talking about. So I'm going to, at this point, but thank you for so much, Dr. Matsumoto. I'm going to now pass on to Jun Saito from the Japan Center for Economic Research. And Jan's joining us previously was at the Economic Planning Agency, which later became the Cabinet Office. And I should let you know that the first time I ever came to Japan, about 20 years ago, was as a guest of the Japanese Cabinet Office, and the Japanese Cabinet Office paid for me to come and visit lots of care homes and day centres and hospitals, and I saw some of the most amazing services across the world. So I don't know if you were there then, but thank you anyway. It was a lovely trip. I learnt a lot. Mr. Saito, please.
Okay, thank you for your kind introduction. First of all, I'd like to thank the International Longevity Center for giving me the opportunity to speak to you in this event. It is an important topic for Japan as well as for other countries around the globe. So I hope I can make some contribution to the discussion. The Healthy Aging and Prevention Index that has been introduced now by Arun is an important input to the policymakers in trying to tackle with the challenges posed by the aging of the population. And in public policy, it is always useful to have a numerical indicator of the current situation as well as a target set for the indicator so that we can plan, do, check, and take action. And this index can be such an indicator in the area of issues related to aging. So I welcome the introduction of this index. But having said that, I think when we make use of the index in individual countries, there needs to be a careful interpretation of what it means. So from now on, I would like to elaborate a bit on this point in the context of Japan. First of all, is about the lifespan measure of the index. It uses the life expectancy at birth, and which I am happy to say that Japan is among the highest in 2019. It has risen consistently in the past 70 years, except for some exception like in 2021, and of course it's because of the COVID. However, the number is an average of life expectancy of females and males. And it is important to note that there's a wide difference between that for the females and that for the males. For Japan, it is about 6 years. And it is important that the gender gap is different from country to country. As you can see in the slides, there's a vast difference among countries in terms of the gap between the genders. So I think it is important to look into the reasons for the differences in difference and address the problem, if there is any. For instance, gender inequality. So I think it is important to look at the gender difference, not just the average. Second is about the health span measure of the index. It uses the health expectancy, which again, the Japan seems to be doing relatively better. However, in Japan, there is about 10 years difference between the life expectancy and the health expectancy, which means that for about 10 years, we have to stay in bed. How we can shorten this period is important for the individual as well as for the society as a whole. The effort towards this end is expected to face a challenge in Japan, and that is especially with regards to dementia. As we extend our life expectancy, there's a higher risk of getting dementia, especially in the case of the females. We saw that females live longer than males, but if they get older, there's a larger possibility, higher possibility of them getting dementia. And so extending health expectancy will only be successful, at least in Japan, if we can be successful in overcoming dementia. So this is a big challenge for Japan. Third is about work span measure. The index uses labor force participation rate, which is according to the index, Japan does not seem to do well. But it is a little bit of a puzzle because labor force participation rate of the elderly, as you can see in this slide, is relatively higher than other countries, at least among the OECD countries. The labor force participation rate of working age population, that is those between 15 and 64, would fall if there is more young people getting higher education. It is evident for the OECD countries. So if you spend more in schools, the labor force participation rate naturally falls. So I don't think it's just looking at the average labor force participation rate is appropriate. Now, so having lower participation rate because of the getting higher education, I don't think is a problem. And if the importance is in the working opportunity for the aged, I think we need to give focus on the labor force participation rate of the aged, not only everyone in the working age. So rather we should think of those aged 65 who are healthy and would like to work, and labor force participation rate of this age group is also high in Japan. But there are people in Japan, perhaps not so many in Japan, who are not able to work even if they want to. So there's not so those who are not in labor force, majority does not want to work. So there's only a small portion who wants to work. But those who wants to work are not able to work because of a number of reasons. But there are people who find that it may be difficult for them to find an appropriate job. So if we can pay an effort in that area, I think we can make an improvement. So, and one of the reasons why these elderlies cannot find a job even they want to is partly because there is a compulsory retirement age in Japan. It's currently 60. I think it's going to move. But because of this, almost everyone has to retire at once. They could be rehired. But there are some people who find it very difficult to get employed. So I think this is the issue that we need to address. Fourth is about income measure. The index uses GDP per capita. In this area, Japan has a lot of problems, I admit. And the problem is also reflected in the slowing down of the potential GDP growth rate in the recent years. It is only about 0.5% at the moment. And since 0.5% here is the potential GDP growth rate, if you think about the labor productivity or the GDP per capita, it should be lower than this. So there is a problem. Now, one of the reasons for the slowdown is the aging and the shrinking of the population that Japan is facing. It causes a number of problems, which includes a pressure on the lifetime employment system we have in Japan. And this is one that was established during the high growth period in the 1960s. It needs to be reformed to match the aging and the shrinking of the population, but has not been able to do so except to adapt to it partially. So the firms are increasing the employment of non-regular workers who are not covered by the lifetime employment system. And they are employed for only fixed term, and they are relatively poorly paid than the regular workers. And in fact, there are many non-regular workers among the females than the males. So to improve the efficiency of the employment system and raise productivity, I think we need to reform the employment system. This is a big, big issue, and it's we could spend hours on this, so I'll stop here, but we do have a problem with our employment system. Fifth is about the environmental performance measure. The index uses Yale Environmental Performance Index, and since the health and the well-being of the elderly could be affected by the climate change and other problems related to environment more than the young, I think it is important to prevent the worsening of the environment. Some advocate that we should cease to grow for the sake of environment. But this index includes both income and environment performance as its a component. So which means that we should pursue both. Okay? So we need to pursue green growth, so to speak. Now, this is a very difficult choice that we have made. I don't think there's other choice, but it's a very difficult choice. So we need to admit that. Now, the sixth measure is the happiness measure. The index uses data from World Happiness Report. Japan is not doing so well in this measure as well. And it is important to understand why this is the case. And since the interest is in aging, it should be important to understand the relationship between happiness and the age. The recent interesting finding in the literature is that there seems to be a U-shaped curve. So happiness falling towards the middle age and then starts to recover as you get older. Now, this applies to Japan as well as in other countries. Now, if this is true, there are arguments in the literature, but if this is true, then we may see a decline in happiness because of the fall in happiness in the middle age, not the aged. So if we are concerned about the age, we need to pay more attention to the relationship between happiness and age. And we should look into the reason why the happiness is not that high. Now, about the economic implications of tackling the aging issue. As for the importance of tackling the aging issue, I don't think there is much to be added. And it is important for an individual to spend a longer life being healthy and happy. And it's also important for the economy to see that elderly are actively engaged in economic activity. However, I may emphasize that in the context of the Japanese economy, it is important for the elderly to remain healthy, both physically and mentally, because of the huge financial assets that is held by the elderly. It is the elderly that hold a large share of financial assets in Japanese economy, which amounts to about 20 223 trillion yen at the end of December 2022. So it's about 4 times GDP. It is a large portion of the elderlies. So if a large portion of the elderlies get dementia, as I mentioned earlier, the mobilization of these assets are going to be very difficult. And this is exactly the concern that the financial institutions have in Japan. So that is why there is a growing interest in financial gerontology. This is increasing, the interest is increasing in the academics and also among the financial industry. So finally, about the policy implications of the index. Touching upon this is important as we are in Niigata and where the G7 finance ministers and central bank governors are going to meet from tomorrow. As we all agree, implementing policies towards healthy aging is important. However, how much and in what way we use public resources towards this end is not an easy issue for any country, but especially for Japan. One of the reasons is that, as we all know, we already have a huge government debt, which amounts to more than 200% of GDP. So we have to deal with this. But another reason is that we are already spending quite an amount of health spending relative to other countries in the OECD countries. This was mentioned by the previous speaker. But this is a fact. We spend a lot in health spending already. In contrast, we are not spending enough in supporting families and children. So family benefits public spending is relatively low among the OECD countries. And how we can spend to support families with children and reverse the downward trend of falling fertility rate is now an important issue in Japan. Okay. Earlier it was mentioned that the Prime Minister is concerned about the aging, but he's also concerned about the shrinking of the population, and he wants to raise the fertility rate. So this is a very important issue in Japan, and so the policy challenge is not to allocate much more on health spending, but to reallocate the resources within health spending so that we can achieve healthy aging. I think that is the issue that we are facing. And I don't think I need to emphasize here that it's not an easy problem to solve. So this is all from me. Thank you very much.
I think clearly there were some really interesting similarities to the UK other than the food. You know, in the UK we have a very significant challenge that most of our assets are held by older people, and there is a perception that older people are spending all the kids' money, but the reality is we know that we have a big problem of underspending in old age, that people are not spending the money they have, which has an impact on how do you create demand if most of the money is being held by a group of the population who aren't holding it. It's very, very similar in other sort of older countries. Clearly, participation in learning was a really important point, I think, because actually what we know is there is a relationship between the relationship between productivity is less related to age than it is to skills and learning. So the ability to keep learning through our lives is extraordinarily important in the UK as well. And then, you know, clearly the happiness, the U-shaped curve, very, very relevant across the world. And finally, you know, very similar issue in the UK as there is in Japan in relation to those people who want to work, except we've got a lot more people who are aged between 50 and 64 who would like to work but they can't because of ill health. So we have over 1 million people who can't work because of either ill health or caring responsibilities. So very, very significant. And just before introducing John, I should say, you know, one of the things we're very jealous of is actually the amazing economic and analytical ability you have in Japan. So I'm very, very grateful for all of that. It's really, really wonderful to have it. And I know one of the things John may talk about is actually links into the U-shaped curve in terms of well-being. We were talking about it a little bit earlier. But let me now just introduce John Bain, who is from the let me get it right, the Senior Research Fellow at the Asian Development Bank in Tokyo. And let me pass on to you. He's heading up the T7, that was what it's called, wasn't it?
Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation to this event today. So I'm John Byrne, Vice Chair of Research at the Asian Development Bank Institute. Just to give a bit of context before I discuss the topic that we have here today, as you all are aware, Japan is the G7, holding the G7 presidency this year, and part of that involves various engagement groups that provide recommendations to Prime Minister Kishida. And ADBI, Asian Development Bank Institute, is the lead chair for the think tank engagement group. So just 2 weeks ago, we provided our recommendations to Prime Minister Kishida, and they cut across many of the issues that were raised today by the speakers. So to give a little bit of background, we had 4 task forces. One was on economic development and prosperity. The second one was on well-being, environmental sustainability and just transition. Third one was on science and technology, and the last one was on peace and security. Now, I think that whilst we had one task force specifically focused on well-being and the issue of healthy lifestyles and so on was a common thread throughout all of the task forces. So that is something I will come back to at the end of my intervention. So I've been asked to talk today about why the G7 would be interested in this, basically, and what the challenges are from the perspective of the G7. So that will be the second part of what I discuss. First point is on the index itself. I would like to congratulate the producers or whoever developed the index. I think it's excellent in terms of providing comparable measures across countries. I would like to see some breakdown, as was mentioned in the previous presentation, on the issue of male versus female, for example. And also, as well as that, it would be useful to look at the economies that are at the bottom of the scale. So what you presented were basically the good economies, but of course they are the economies that face the least amount of challenges. So the real work needs to be done at the other end of the scale. So it would be useful to flesh that out a bit. But overall, I very much welcome the index, and I look forward to even using it in some empirical work. And yeah, congratulations for that. Second point is why the G7 would be interested in this issue. So I mentioned before that one of the task forces that at ADBI we looked at was on well-being itself. So well-being and healthy aging and prevention of illness is crucial to economic development, and it feeds into sustainable development. As we are all aware, we're at the midpoint of the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, and I think well-being fits into essentially all of those SDGs. 15 out of 17, in fact, are specifically looking at the issue of well-being as being a contributor to the achievement of those SDGs. So why would the G7 be interested in this? Well, it's quite clear. I mean, the G7 is interested in the pursuit of the global common goals, which are the SDGs. And part of that will involve partnership with other economies at the global level. So that's why I said at the beginning, it's important to look at the economies at the lower end of the scale, where there's a great amount of inequality, which was mentioned in the initial presentation. Inequality is key, for example. And those developing economies that are facing issues around food insecurity, issues around poverty, inequality, and also debt sustainability is another common factor for these developing economies. These are the same economies that are suffering in terms of lack of health, unhealthy lifestyles, and these are the economies that are at the bottom end of the scale. Now, the G7 is interested in, achieving the SDGs, but that's a futile exercise unless the developing economies are included in that pursuit. So it must be done at a partnership level. We saw from the list of economies that were at the top end of the scale. These are all the G7 economies. These are the richer economies, of course. So, you know, it really needs to be taken from a global perspective on why the G7 would be interested in that. And this is something that Prime Minister Kishida has voiced repeatedly this year, that an inclusive sort of partnership type of approach with developing economies, the so-called Global South, is crucial for the development of, or the achievement of the SDGs on global goals around climate, for example. These cannot be achieved just by the G7 nations or even just by the G20 nations. It must be done at a really global level, including developing economies. So that's why the G7 should be interested in marking this as a priority area. And I think it's quite clear how important the issue is. As I said, it feeds into all of the other areas. I think previous speakers have talked about the economic benefits, the savings in terms of fiscal expenditure over the longer term, the increases that it can have in terms of productivity, and income per head is another factor which can reap rewards over the longer term. So I think I'll stop there given the time. Thank you.
And I think your point at the beginning about the other end of the scale really important. So, for example, one of the things that we found is actually, if you look over the sort of past decade or so, actually some of the poorer countries have actually improved much better than the richer countries, because in terms of, for example, access to universal health coverage, you've seen very significant growth. So I think there will be a really interesting question about whether they do catch up, some of the poor countries. And of course, the next G20 next year is being held in South Africa, and clearly, you know, one of our groupings is that Africa. It'd be really interesting to look at sort of how and which African countries are likely to develop better healthcare systems, and how and what lessons there are from that. And I think the other thing, your point about gender was also very important. And clearly one of the things I might ask you at the end is there anything else we should include in the index? Is there anything else we should be thinking about comparing countries or organisations? Would you like us to compare? Because of course one of the other things we can do is start to compare where someone sits on the index with, for example, you know, spending on certain activities, or on, you know, car ownership or smoking levels, or so we could be looking at all sorts of different things as well, which would be interesting. Let me, for our final contribution before we open for a few minutes of speaking, let me introduce my colleague Esther, who's going to talk a little bit about the work we're doing around life course immunisation. I think we were just keen that we, as well as talking about the big picture issues, we talked about some examples of real sort of on the ground, you know, preventative interventions that exist across the world, and what we could do to think a bit more about how we can maximise their potential. And clearly, we're in relation to COVID, of course. You know, whereas I think Japan started a little bit slowly in terms of vaccination. Actually, uptake was then astonishingly high, very, very high, and the, you know, worked very, very well. So I think there's some really interesting lessons from that. So Esther, let me kick you off.
Thank you, David. So thank you all so much for being here. My name's Esther McNamara. I'm the Senior Health Policy Lead at ILC UK. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you all about immunisation across the life course as an underused and cost-effective form of prevention. So you know a little bit about ILC by now. So the key rationale that is the foundation of everything we're doing in this project is that immunisation is safe and effective. Beyond access to clean water and sanitation, it's one of the most effective ways we have to prevent over 20 life-changing diseases. Programs of vaccination are already widely used across different countries. Most of us in our childhood would have had some vaccinations of some form, and those may or may not continue into our adulthood, depending on our access to safe and affordable healthcare, to quality affordable healthcare. The reason for this project is we're not where we should be. So on this slide, I've used measles as sort of a temperature check for how we are doing broadly on immunisation post-pandemic. Obviously, the COVID pandemic disrupted everything, our healthcare, our travel, our work, everything. And childhood immunisation was no exception. So you can see in 2021, the first dose measles coverage was at its lowest level since 2008, and only 81% and 71% respectively of children around the world have received their first and second measles doses. Measles is, like I say, a crucial indicator because we've had wide-ranging and successful vaccine programs in the past. So as like you can see here, there was a 73% drop in measles infections between 2000 and 2018. So monitoring this is a good measure for how childhood vaccination is doing more broadly. But what about us? What about us adults? We all need immunisation across our life course, particularly as we've covered today. Our global population of older people is increasing. So by 2050, it's expected to double to 2.1 billion people over 60. We know that older people draw more on healthcare resources more often, and some healthcare systems, such as the NHS in the UK, where we come from, invest up to half of their resources in people over 60. Therefore, the longevity dividend of perhaps redirecting and in the long term reducing that spend could be enormous. So, as we say, adult vaccination is lagging. So perhaps one of the reasons for this is because we expect it to lag behind childhood vaccination. We expect that 95% of children receive certain numbers of vaccines, as the World Health Organization targets indicate, but with adults we seem to be content with a 75% target, which obviously there's a huge difference in those two numbers, and that's a lot of older people as our population continues to grow. I've included some statistics about the uptake of seasonal flu vaccines post-pandemic, partly because of the importance of that vaccine, having spent many months indoors in lockdown restrictions or limiting our contact with other people. What more important time could there be to get to your flu vaccine? So you can see on the slide, for people over 65 and for people under that age but at risk due to pre-existing conditions, the data coverage, first of all, and then the level of coverage that people have of flu vaccination does vary significantly within the G7. Hence, the World Health Organization's immunisation agenda for 2030, which ILC did feed into as well. So this is a strategy for expanding the existing programs we have and developing new programs too, to deliver vaccines consistently across the life course, so for children, for adults and older adults. And the next thing is for governments to take up this agenda. So we learned from COVID that vaccine preventable diseases affect every aspect of our economy. We have economists in the room who can tell us that very clearly. So we all know from the individual level, if I were to catch COVID and be absent from work, that would have an effect on the money I earn. In the UK, your statutory sick pay is less than most people's salary. I wouldn't be spending on my commute. I wouldn't be socialising for a few days. So there's all of those microeconomic impacts on my own life. All the way up to COVID-19, which was a total shutdown of the global economy, which cost all of us £12.5 trillion, which is a number too big to really wrap your head around. So given that the need to change course is so great after COVID-19, how do we understand what vaccination can offer? We need to have, before we implement these life course immunisation programs, we need to clearly understand what the value would be. So we have categorised those in 4 ways. And I will go into each of these in more detail. So first, reducing the healthcare costs in the short term by treating the diseases that are preventable. Reducing healthcare costs down the line of secondary infections or conditions. Third is the microeconomic costs, as I just explained, of keeping people in work. And fourth is supporting the wider economy through a myriad of differences in terms of keeping people in work across their life course, fewer pressures on the healthcare system, frees up more money for other things, people drawing on their pensions later. So let's dive into those in a bit more detail. So I've gathered some statistics here about the cost of treating particularly infections, but conditions that are preventable by vaccines. So for example, in Spain, they spent, how much did they spend? 134 million euros in 2015, purely on treating things that could have been vaccinated against. In the UK, the cost of one vaccine preventable disease, which is pneumococcal disease, totaled £731 million, which is 911 million US dollars in 1 year. So the costs are already mounting of treating things that we could be preventing through life course vaccination. But those healthcare costs are only a drop in the ocean when we look at the whole picture. So this is an example of a study from an outbreak of measles in the US in 2018. So we saw from the other presentations that the US spends a lot of money on their healthcare, but their healthcare direct costs are only the very smallest fraction of the cost of this measles outbreak. So the larger amount of it was productivity losses, so people not attending work as normal, but the vast majority of this was the public health response that was required. So quarantining people and all of the other things that would be involved to stop measles from spreading. And the total cost of that outbreak was $3.4 million US dollars. So that's the infections that we can prevent. Secondary to that, there are other infections, and I've included some statistics here, of when you prevent one infection or one condition, there are often secondary things that the person might have had you not vaccinated them. As an example, people who've had flu or pneumonia vaccinations may be 6 times more likely to suffer from a heart attack or stroke in the days after infection. So not only are you treating that person who may still be contagious for flu or still have pneumonia, you may also end up treating them directly for that heart attack. We'll all be familiar with long COVID, which around 65 million people worldwide are estimated to be suffering with, and that has the knock-on effects for their lives as well that we will dive into in more detail. So the third way we value life course immunisation is, what do people stop doing when they are ill? So people tend to stop working, which in 2022 cost the US $8 billion, purely in absence of paid employment. And that, as we can see, that was a much larger proportion of this £11 billion total than the direct medical costs. So the costs are smaller, the direct economic impact is massive, but then what about everything else? Because in our lives, we don't just go to work and come home. There are plenty of other things that we do that are affected when we are unwell. And I'll echo back to the research from ILC that David mentioned in his introduction. We'll stick with this for a minute. So countries that spend more on health, people not only work, but they volunteer, care, and spend more for longer. So people who report being in good health are 4 times more likely to be in work between the ages of 50 and 65, and 10 times more likely to be working between 65 and 74. Every euro invested in vaccination generates a €4 return in the long term. That's not just the immediate employment benefits that we spoke about under Section 3. This is everything that people do in their lives. So maybe they're providing informal care, maybe they are volunteering and contributing to their local community, but this number comes from some research that ILC did with this SATU report that I will cite at the end of the presentation. That's a big number. That's a good returns. I'm not an economist, but given that this is a low ball number in a sense, so this is for countries that already have a substantial infrastructure for vaccination, whereas countries that have that all to develop, this return could be much bigger indeed. And in the midst of COVID, obviously we see from this graph that different countries are in need of new routes and strategies in order to recover. So the world average for economies recovery post-COVID is pretty good, but it varies by the existing wealth that the countries already had. So every country could gain something and help with their COVID recovery through life course vaccination. So the consequences of COVID-19, as we've touched on today, I've already addressed this $12.5 trillion number. That's the global loss of productivity as a result of the pandemic. COVID had a few other impacts too that all governments and all of us should bear in mind moving forward. So COVID showed us the level of inequality that there is in each society and in between countries in access to healthcare and access to resource. We also learned a lot about trust in vaccination, which is a really key consideration for governments who want to improve or expand their vaccine programs. It's difficult to assess cost effectiveness of life course immunisation. So I've obviously spent this presentation saying yes, there is a cost benefit, it is worth our doing, but just because it's difficult to measure doesn't mean we should underestimate its value. So I've used an example here of one systematic review which looked at a range of studies of flu vaccine cost effectiveness analyses in the EU, and 7 out of 8, so not all of them, found at least one cost effective scenario for seasonal flu vaccination programs. The issue with measuring cost effectiveness is that you could get 5 different people to do the same task and measure the cost effectiveness of this vaccine. Some will take into account different indicators essentially. So one might focus on the direct economic cost, one might focus on the volunteering or other resources that the person would generate in their lifetime with that vaccine as opposed to without it. But it is clear that investing in life course immunisation will generate substantial returns. So this is a call to action for governments and health leaders to prioritise life course immunisation programmes. They're not just a nice to have, they're an important investment in our ageing populations and our overstretched health services. Focusing on the whole life impacts of ill health as well as the economic consequences is key to understanding the full value of prevention through immunisation. So these are some questions that I might leave up on the slide for us to discuss. We are at the very start of this project about life course immunisation, and we'd love to know your thoughts on what else could we include, what else should we think about, and what stops people from coming forward for their immunisations, particularly in their adulthood. But before I conclude, I'll just direct you to what happens next with this project. So we are holding a roundtable discussion alongside the launch of our prevention index at the World Health Assembly in Geneva. Further down the line, we will also be influencing the G20 in India later this year, and we will conclude the project with a global launch of our findings at an event in London. These are some resources on the ILC website, because ILC has an expertise in adult immunisation. There's lots of work and there's quite a lot of reports on it as well, including this, which may be of interest from a couple of years ago. How should we improve uptake of adult immunisation in Japan? But for now, I will leave these questions up. Thank you so much for your time.
And I think clearly, one of the things we wanted to do was with have the conversation about immunisation was highlight that we often underestimate the value of prevention, and we could equally be looking at falls programs or diabetes programs or the failure to adhere to medication or screening, and all of these have a much bigger benefit than we sometimes take account of with traditional cost effectiveness measures. And as Esther said, clearly the question of cost effectiveness, it's increasingly difficult to measure. If you prevent something, it's really then difficult to make a cost effectiveness measure. So a good example with vaccination is something like tetanus, where we have almost no incidence of tetanus anymore. So how can we ever prove that it's cost effective, because we don't know how many we're preventing anymore? It's very, very difficult with once we've successfully prevented to then measure how effective the value of those are. So I think I'm just going to, we've got about 15 or 20 minutes, just sort of hopefully open up for across the board any conversations or comments or challenges that anyone would like, or indeed any questions for our speaker. Yeah.
About the immunization.
Yeah.
What's that? I wasn't quite sure about the basic concerns that you had. Is it right to understand that it's the low immunization rate of elderly that is a concern? But if it's so, it's quite different from Japan, because in Japan, the immunization of the elderly are very high compared to the young. So I think the problem differs from country to country. That's something that you need to take into account. That's one thing. Another thing is that one of the benefits that we learned that you can get from immunization is that in addition to what you have mentioned, we can avoid the collapse of the health system. We can also avoid the lockdowns, soft ones and the hard ones. These are the economic costs that we have to incur. It depends on the disease, naturally, but I think this is something that we learned from the COVID-19. Finally, I think you have talked about the vaccines that you already existed, but there are vaccines that doesn't exist, and especially with regards to rare disease. And the market is too small for the pharmaceutical companies to develop vaccines. And that's why we have some experiments like advanced market commitments. And I think it's something very important. But I think you also need to think about how we develop those important vaccinations which doesn't exist.
I think that's a really important point. And in fact, I was talking to a company a couple of weeks ago about dengue, and of course you have other, where how do you develop vaccines in this space, but clearly also things like we are seeing. I think one of the interesting things about adults is across the world you see, and of course mandatory vaccination for children, but actually very, very different story for adults. And I think one of the really interesting sort of challenges that then comes from that is actually one thing we should reflect on is this is new. It's only 20 years since we had an age-related influenza vaccine in the past. So and now we have pneumococcal and flu and shingles. So you're seeing much change quickly. But please let me. Yeah. Go on. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's why I think I need to speak out about the impact of immunization on this health. Depending on the genders and also ages, the immunization program differs, and including the major disease or infection, and also rare disease, like he said. But the point is that those fixed program of immunization has been there all over the world, and it's been working well, and some part not, but in Japan it's been very established. But on top of it, we have this problem, COVID-19. In addition to our research and development of vaccines, but also a policy making of vaccination or immunization program differs too much so much between the countries. And then, like Esther, you mentioned this immunization agenda 2030. The motto is to leave no one's behind. So the who are left over, the immunizations, so we think it's over, but in Africa, there are almost nobody who are immunized with the COVID-19 vaccine, while we are talking about 6th, 7th, 9th, 8th, 9th vaccination of same COVID-19 vaccine. So this is the issues that for the preventions opportunity are very different between countries. And then since it's discussions here, I can just post one answer of the second one, that everybody now knows that this is a vaccine hesitancy. Nothing to do with the science or R&D, but vaccine hesitancy will prevent most of this prevention program that we are now offering to the world.
No, I think that's an important point, and my understanding is that is actually on the G7 agenda. There is a real concern around vaccine hesitancy. Although what's interesting is it, particularly in Western Europe, but we often talk about vaccine hesitancy, and then 9 out of 10 people vaccine. So actually, how hesitant are we really, and actually, what can governments do to overcome that? Really interesting. We have very interesting sort of situation in France, where traditionally there's been very, very strong vaccine hesitancy, but as soon as the government said you can't go to a cafe unless you're vaccinated, everyone didn't care that much. but so there are real challenges. But that's a really, really important point. Does anyone want else to come in on these questions, or anything broader in terms of, please?
Yes. My name is Aki Saito. I'm the pediatrician, major in pediatric infectious disease. And one thing which I noticed was that I know the life course immunization is very important concept in Japan too. But as a pediatrician, we have established system to immunize children. Pediatrician, you can go to pediatrician, they know how to immunize the children. But for the adults, it is very difficult. We don't have the established system for adult immunization. Even there isn't good immunization schedule exists for the adults. So we have a very important immunization for adults, but the system itself is pretty poor in Japan. So to develop the life course immunization, it is very important to focus on the system, how to deliver vaccination in adults. That's my... Yeah,
I think we're extraordinarily important. And as a separate project, we've been doing a specific project looking at immunization in Japan, which we're going to be launching in October in Japan. So we will see you all in Tokyo, perhaps, to talk about that. But exactly this issue come up, that actually the infrastructure around adults is different. But I think there were some really interesting ideas of what you could do and what Japan could do to sort of increase up to date.
There is a society called the Primary Care Association has been working on this, and then they are trying to develop the adult immunization program, but the part of the population of the doctors are very small. I think UK, you have a GP, so they provide vaccines for adults, but in Japan, we don't have that system.
No, one of our key findings is, of course, that the GP has an incentive to vaccinate, whereas in Japan there isn't, other than the letter you get every 5 years for pneumococcal or every year for flu. There isn't anyone else going and encouraging you to do it, whereas in the UK we send GPs encourage people to go. But also there's a really interesting thing around technology where, where actually in the UK we have weekly data on uptake. So if a local area has low uptake of influenza vaccine, that week they will contact, the Department of Health will contact the doctor and say, why haven't you done anyone this week? And typically it will be because a fridge has failed or something's gone wrong, but actually they will be absolutely, and the problem with almost every other country, and this is one area where the UK does as you saw, flew well, is that if you wait to the end of the year to count what your uptake is, it's too late to manage it. So we have data available immediately. How do you manage it on a weekly basis almost to target then interventions where you may need it? So it's a really interesting one. Thank you, Doctor. Please, John.
Yes, thanks for the presentation. I think what I want to look at will be linking this issue of immunization with your index, and then to understand how it can affect then, well-being over the longer term. And then the next issue then I have, which I didn't mention in the presentation or my comments earlier, was on the issue of how to mainstream well-being into basically every other major development policy issue, because it factors in all of the other policy issues. Therefore, I think one of the challenges that governments face is how to mainstream that into other policy areas in an effective way. So just those two comments.
Yeah, again, I think very useful. And of course, one thing where, and we've done a lot of work historically with people like the World Economic Forum, and one of the organisations in the UK we work with is Legal and General, and you're starting to see, even amongst the sort of most sort of traditionally capitalist organisations, a really interesting debate on different measures of wealth. This question about whether GDP is the best way of measuring societal progress. And this is no longer, this is mainstream financial service organisations saying, well, maybe we should think about happiness and well-being as much as we think, not least for the point you made around actually the relationship between the green economy and the need for economic growth, because clearly, in places like London, being stuck in a traffic jam might increase GDP, but it isn't adding to anyone's well-being. So recognising how we change that, I think, is extraordinarily important. Does someone else want to come in there?
So for the index that is discussed in G7, I would also post one of the keywords that you're working on the G7 healthcare part. It's not a completely new keywords, but global health. I mean, within for the universal health coverage, and then people started talk about One Health, including all this natures and animals. And nowadays, the people start using the planetary health. So to prevent or to get the happiness of human health, we need to think about the planet health. So that includes greens, climate changes, and so on. So in order to get this whole risk and benefit of human health requires the countermeasure of the planetary health. So for this, I don't know, cost performance is so much difficult now to measure in case of this one human health disease per se. And for the happiness, we always discuss about this vaccine field, the risk and benefit ratios. Like David suggested, we don't see the benefit. How do you measure the benefit having nothing as a disease? It's not just the cost. So this is probably we don't, very difficult to measure as an index, but I think we have to visualize or make it countable for this kind of benefit.
No, I think, and clearly the relationship between vaccine preventable disease or infectious diseases generally and climate change is extraordinarily important, whether that be risk of growth in things like dengue or tick-borne disease, other tick-borne diseases. We are likely to see more infectious diseases as a result of climate change and diseases in different bits of the world as well. Please.
I'm here, I'm representing NSD, but as a comment, as a clinician practicing actually UK NHS, and also a clinician here in Japan, I think echoing Dr. Sato's comment regards to life course immunization reality in Japan is that, yes, we do have a very invested, well-working system for pediatric vaccination. I think there are a lot more a complex hurdle regards to vaccination uptake in latter part of the life course. Even though with the COVID, you may think that Japan may have succeeded in vaccinating rapidly across the generation. I think the fundamental issue around how the clinician who takes care of the adolescent and the latter part of the population, as Dr. Saito mentioned, is not really engaged and incentivized and used to understanding the importance of, well, maybe understanding in their head, but actually within their busy practice, it's not actually in place for easy vaccination of these post-pediatric population. And to drive that, I think, first of all, I think we need a very concrete and real-time data in terms of national-wide vaccination that actually provides PDCA cycle for these adult population. I think it's a myth to say that Japan is doing well in terms of high aging society, and that the fact that worldwide we are drawing attention as a leading high aging society, I think we can do much more with data collection and also having a suggestion and use case for better incentivizing and recommending vaccination for elderlies and the post-pediatric population in terms of prevention. And I think in terms of economic, I think as John mentioned, I think it's important that we help the policymakers bring the value of vaccination mainstream. And I think in that sense, the cost effectiveness narrative, the economic narrative is important. And I think rather than coming to the table and say prevention is extra cost, but actually saving in a much more appealing numerical way will help drive these political decisions to overcome the hurdle, because it's not only the cost, particularly for Japan at least. I think there's practical hurdles for clinicians to actually vaccinate their elderly who, in terms of Japan, who we have very good access to physicians. So just commenting that I think we are now at the good place to present this issue and get recognized.
Brilliant. No, that's really, really useful. And I'm very conscious of time, and we promised half past. But is there any final comments before? Please.
I would like to introduce one field survey by Niigata company holding this March about vaccine promotion for shingle vaccine, herpes. We did an online survey for 4,000 people about whether or not he or she get a single vaccine, why. And the hurdle of vaccination, one is price, and the second one is not knowing where to get it, as well as lack of information about herpes or shingles. But the key trigger of a vaccine take is more detailed information about symptom of diseases. So maybe not only vaccine is important or whatever, what the symptom you will get without vaccination, this kind of information is really needed. And also the source of information is not TV or not internet or not even medical professional, but just the family members or just close friend. So we need to promote community communication or small team communication about vaccination promotion. And to do that, I strongly recommend to utilize payer side, health insurance, because we have universal health coverage. And maybe because of lifetime employment system, usually most of the people in Japan belongs to the same health insurance for a long time. So they have rather strong community as insurance subscribers or members. So how to promote this kind of communication or trend within health insurance is one way to promote vaccine shot. So we will start this kind of initiative based on this online survey. So if you're get interested in, please let me know. We will discuss maybe afterwards.
Great. Please, yeah. Please, yeah.
Comment about the vaccination itself.
Yep.
I think the coming 2023 winter season is a chance for us to, we are kind of, as a society, we get accustomed to get vaccination by the experience of COVID-19 for these 3 years. So people's kind of anxiety or fear for the vaccination itself might have been lowered. And people today think that the COVID is almost over because it's not over yet. But anyway, people are feeling about that. So the 2023 winter, we will face the flu season again. And then people's awareness of the importance of vaccination has been raised by the COVID experience. So I think the 2023 might be a good time for doing the kind of massive campaign to raise the people's awareness globally, especially in the north side of the globe. When we will see the massive outbreak of flu in winter, and it might lead to the awareness of the other type of vaccines to the people in general.
No, I think that's a really important point. And please, yeah.
Quick comment on those discussions that prevention that we keep discussing last year vaccination program is the education of younger children. In addition to those survey is important for the adults, but the longer term education of the children about the risk and benefit evaluation of your own health is the key. And I think that it takes time, but it's worth going for to promote this education program for healthcare. That is very less in Japan. We are very good at mathematics or some science educations, but not really for the healthcare educations.
Great. No, really good. I think, just to finish my, I think that is extraordinarily important. But I do think, as someone with a 16-year-old, we have a generation coming up who will be smarter than we are. They're clever, they're engaged, and actually one of the things that's really striking, I think, with younger people is, my 16-year-old goes onto these Reddit websites, these sort of social media accounts where they ridicule people who are anti-vaccine. So he's very, very engaged in these things. But actually, there is a group of younger people who absolutely sort of are engaged in the health. And there is some evidence across the world. We talked about some of the challenges with the UK and the US around things like nutrition and drugs. But there is some evidence across the world that that younger people are drinking less than older people. They're participating in less unsafe sex. They're taking less drugs. There's a really, and this is not just, this is, and it's not entirely clear why, but it does appear as though there might be a generation coming through across the world who sort of are going to be potentially healthier than this generation. So maybe there's an opportunity there to jump on, I think. Go on, please.
Is there a discussion about linking vaccination with insurance premiums?
With insurance
contribution? Because, not being vaccinated means a high risk. So, just like auto insurance.
Yeah, I definitely think that you will start to see that. You don't in the UK because we don't have very much private insurance. But I think there is certainly debate on whether if people look after themselves and maintain their, we should be thinking about how you use that to incentivize behaviours. But actually, one of the challenges we have in the UK is the nature of the healthcare system. But actually, there are also private companies, private healthcare. I think actually one of the interesting things is actually even private healthcare in the UK, doesn't do enough around vaccination. So they will do things on, if you go to the gym, you will save £10 on your cinema tickets, and if you do this, you will. But actually, they don't link vaccination with some of the best employers in the UK who might have smoking schemes, smoking cessation schemes, or they might have physical activity schemes. They don't have anything around vaccines. So there's something around vaccines that just hasn't got there. But I suspect because of COVID, it will. I think you will see things changing with that.
What I know about incentive for the vaccination program, the best is in the US that none of this insurance incentive worked. Rather, not incentive, but the best working model was to get the immunization mandatory for entering elementary school.
And I think also making it accessible. So one thing you're seeing across the world is a big growth in pharmacists actually administering vaccinations. So you've gone from, 3 or 4 countries prior to COVID to now 40 countries where pharmacists are not just delivering the vaccine, they're actually administering as well. So you are starting to see, I think, sort of changes to make access a bit easier. And one of the things that just a sort of slightly, interesting, I will sort of finish because I'm very conscious of your time, and I think there is more food than we have for 20 people. So I do hope you will at least stay and have something. But actually, we did a little piece of work alongside, actually around, how do you get people to take all of their medicines? So there's a big problem that people are prescribed medicines and then they don't take all the medicines, and it costs huge amounts of money, and there's lots of waste, and of course people don't necessarily then get the benefit of the medication because they stop taking it. And we looked at, I don't know if you remember, but during COVID initially there were lots of initiatives to encourage people to have vaccination across the world, and they were everything from, I think in Thailand there was competitions to win an elephant. In one American state you could have won a gun or some marijuana. That you saw in Hong Kong, Disney gave away free bags if you had your COVID. You had all of these incentives. One of the really interesting things is, from looking at, there was no evidence that any of it really worked. But your point remains, how. So if it didn't, and I'm not saying it didn't work. What I'm saying is we didn't properly study whether or not those sorts of things worked, which was I think a missed opportunity with vaccination, because actually, can we identify that if you do X, it will encourage people? Because I think you do have to be a bit careful, because what you don't want is any perception that someone is only being vaccinated, dated because there is an incentive for the person who's delivering the vaccine to give it. You want the science to hold out rather than it to be any perception of people are only doing because they're being paid to do it, for example. So I think there's an important challenge there. As I say, I'm really conscious of time, in your time. I do hope you will stay and have a chat. And I haven't yet exchanged cards with everyone, so I bought lots of cards. So please do stay and we have a drink with us and grab some food. Alongside this event, we're also going to be, and my colleagues put them up there, we have a dinner next week in Hiroshima. So if any of you are in Hiroshima next week alongside the ministers, we do hope, and I think there are at least 3 or 4 of you joining us for that. So please do join us, and I'm promised healthy food. So please do join us for that. Then we also have a couple of events in Geneva, one specifically on vaccination, and then one where we are going to be launching this index. And as I say, we are going to be, the 2 in Geneva will be accessible remotely, so you'll be able to stream them. And the time difference for the vaccination one won't be too bad. So it's lunchtime in Geneva, so it will be in the early evening here. So if you'd like to join us at any of these, please let us know, particularly for next Thursday, and we can add you to the list. At that point, I'm going to start. Aaron, have you got anything else you'd like to add?
No, I was really interested in all the comments that were made today, and I think just to pick up on the point around gender. So I think was quite convenient is for lifespan, health span, and also work span, we have data on gender. So there's a possibility of looking at those 3 specific metrics and comparing whether how countries do for each of the 2 genders. And then the other point I wanted to make was, well, sort of related to that is, this is of course a top-level approach. We're looking at so many different countries. So I think obviously there's going to be a lot of inequalities within countries that obviously people like yourselves today can come in and bring that perspective to the conversation. But certainly when we're looking at things like gender, that's certainly available to some extent at the global level. Other inequalities are much harder to flesh out. The other point I also wanted to raise, just based off of some of the data looking at Japan specifically, the index currently looks at data from 2019, so it's pre-COVID. So next year we can hopefully have data from 2022. Hopefully we can then see a difference, especially post-COVID, pre and post-COVID as well, which will be hopefully yield some very interesting results.